Have you ever felt the world close in around you so fast that every breath feels like a countdown? That was how Staff Sergeant Miller and his six-man team from the 101st Airborne felt as they pressed themselves against the cold, mud-slicked roots of the Phui jungle. Darkness wasn't just around them, it was swallowing them. Every drop of rain hitting the dense canopy above was a drumbeat, marking the seconds that they didn't have. "Too quiet," whispered Private Daniels, his teeth chattering from more than just the monsoon. Miller didn't answer. He could feel it in the air. The enemy was close. Too close. And not just any enemy. Men who knew this jungle like it was sewn into their skin, who could follow footprints older than the soldiers themselves. Then it came. A faint shuffle, barely audible over the pounded rain, like smoke curling across wet leaves. Miller's hand went up, a silent order. His team froze, bodies pressed into the mud, faces smeared with grime and fear. Around them the jungle seemed to breathe, waiting, watching. The radio crackled, barely audible, distorted by static, but then a voice emerged. "Dingo 5, do you read me?" The accent was sharp, controlled, unmistakably Australian. Calm, precise. A voice that promised salvation in a place where hope had already drowned. Miller's mind raced. Who could reach them here? Helicopters wouldn't cut through this storm. Artillery was impossible. And yet somehow help was coming. Silent, invisible, and deadly. Less than 2 kilometers away, 5 men from the Australian SAS Regiment were already moving through the jungle like shadows made of mist. No twig snapped beneath their boots. No leaf betrayed their passage. Corporal Ryan Stone led the point, scanning the ground, reading the story of every branch, every footprint, every displaced stone. Behind him, Sergeant Thomas Blake orchestrated the movement like a conductor, freezing, fading, disappearing, all while time itself seemed to slow. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a masterclass in invisibility, discipline honed over decades of jungle warfare. Every movement counted. One mistake, one cough, one heartbeat too loud, and the Americans would be lost. Miller pressed the radio again, voice trembling. "If anyone is out there, ghosts." It wasn't a joke. Not here, not now. The jungle was alive with menace. Every sound, the drip of water from leaves, the distant crack of a branch, the whisper of wind, was magnified in the minds of men who had already faced death too many times. Corporal Stone crept forward, boots barely brushing the saturated earth, eyes scanning shadows that could be friend or foe. His fingers tightened around the rifle, though the barrel never rose above the line of sight, invisible in the dim light. Sergeant Blake followed, scanning the terrain as if it were a map etched into his mind. A fallen tree trunk became a bridge, a pile of vines, a shield. Every movement was measured, deliberate, designed to be unnoticed. 30 meters ahead, a flicker of movement. The enemy, maybe 3 men, patrolling like predators. Blake raised his fist. Instantly, the patrol stopped. Not a twitch, not a whisper. Not even a controlled breath escaped them. They were statues. The jungle absorbed them. And in that absorption, they became more than soldiers. They became ghosts. Stone pointed forward. The patrol had turned, drifting away from their path, unknowingly allowing the SAS a silent corridor to advance. Blake exhaled, barely moving, signaling the next phase. Fade. Fade was not walking, and it was not crawling. It was movement slower than thought, slower than reaction, so subtle that even the sharpest eye would perceive nothing amiss. The 5 men slid forward, each footfall absorbed by mud, each body angled to merge with roots, ferns, and shadows. They moved as one fluid entity, invisible in their intent. Behind them, the Americans huddled, whispering prayers and counting breaths. Every thud of the heart, every tremor of fear was amplified by the expectation of rescue. They didn't know these men were more than soldiers. They were legends, the kind of warriors who had walked through jungles in Borneo and Malaya, leaving nothing but a memory of movement and a silence so profound it could choke a man. Then came the first test. A patrol of North Vietnamese soldiers, perhaps a squad, moved between them and the Americans. Footsteps pressing into mud, helmets reflecting scant light, voices murmuring commands. Blake froze. Stone froze. Every man became part of the earth itself. The enemy passed within 10 meters. One soldier paused, head tilting as if listening to the forest's secrets. A bead of rain rolled down his temple, falling near the hand of Corporal Stone. Nothing moved. The soldier stepped on, muttering, and was gone. The team exhaled, silently, imperceptibly. The Americans had no idea what had just passed, but they would soon learn. Blake signaled forward with a subtle flick of his fingers. The fade resumed. Step by step, they closed the distance. Every bent blade of grass, every disturbed fern was read and corrected for. The jungle was a chessboard, and the SAS were playing 3 moves ahead. Minutes stretched. Then, from the radio pack, Roland whispered, "Faint signal. The Americans are still alive." Relief flashed, but there was no time for celebration. The enemy was not idle. Somewhere ahead, they were tightening their net, forming the spiral of pursuit that had become nightmare legend for anyone caught in it. Blake's eyes narrowed. He knew instinctively the enemy had elite trackers on their side. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. Bent blades of grass, stones displaced without scuff marks, webs stretched unnaturally. Viet Cong, a hunter from the Viet Cong's elite special operations. Patient, methodical, lethal. Blake's mind worked fast. His only option: detach. He signaled Stone and the patrol to hold at a dense bamboo thicket, giving precise instructions for the Americans to continue toward the extraction point in 20 minutes. Then he stripped his pack, keeping only his sidearm, knife, and garrote wire. He melted into the jungle alone, a predator tracking another predator. Every sound, every scent, every subtle vibration was analyzed. He could feel the Viet Cong watching, feeling, calculating. A deadly game of chess with the jungle itself as referee. An hour passed like minutes. The 2 hunters circled each other in near silence. A snap of a twig was a threat. The rustle of leaves a misdirection. A call from a night bird could betray presence or be dismissed as background noise. Blake had to anticipate every possibility. Then, as if time itself bent to the will of survival, Blake created a faint sound to the left and froze. The Viet Cong shifted, attention pulled. That fraction of a second was all Blake needed. He moved right, closing distance silently, striking in a blur of controlled precision. The struggle was brief, intimate, brutal. No gunshots, no cries. Just the suffocating darkness of the jungle, a blade, and the cessation of life. In less than 5 seconds, the hunter became the hunted. Blake stood over the fallen commando, pulse steady, heart cold. Survival demanded this. Victory had no need for celebration. The night pressed on, thick and suffocating, as if the Phui jungle itself had decided to test the limits of every man within it. The rain had slowed to a relentless drizzle, but the soil beneath their feet was now a quagmire, sucking boots and legs alike with every step. Sergeant Blake moved at the front, eyes scanning the dark, reading every shadow and broken branch like lines in a deadly book. Behind him, Corporal Stone, Trooper Quinn, Rowland, and Lawson flanked the American team. Their bodies fused with the jungle, moving as one entity. The 6 Americans from the 101st Airborne were barely able to keep up. Mud clung to their uniforms, weighing down each step, sweat mingling with rainwater, stinging eyes, and blurring vision. Every snapped twig and rustled leaf sent jolts of terror through them. They knew they were being hunted, and the sounds of the enemy were always just a heartbeat away. Miller kept his face low, directing his men through hand signals, learned in training, but made painfully real in the chaos of this night. The faint crackle of static echoed in Roland's headset. A fragment of the earlier radio contact had returned, almost drowned by the storm, but enough to remind the Americans that help was near. They clung to that hope like life itself depended on it, because in this environment, it truly did. "Move slowly," Blake whispered, his breath almost a ghost in the humid air. Not a sound, not a twitch. Every second counts. The Americans mirrored the SAS movement as best they could, mimicking the gliding, deliberate crawl that had become their lifeline. But their fear betrayed them in tiny ways. A foot landing too hard, a gasp, the shuffle of fatigues against soaked earth. Each infraction was a knife at the edge of disaster, yet the Australians corrected without a word, subtle gestures, slight nudges, guiding them deeper into the shadow of the jungle. Ahead, the faint outlines of enemy patrols began to take shape. Blake spotted 3 figures moving in a shallow defile, rifles angled and scanning methodically. He froze, hand raised in a silent command. Every member of the group dropped to the earth, becoming nothing more than part of the foliage. A beam of light cut through the darkness, scanning the area just meters from their faces. The Americans froze, eyes wide, lungs constricted, hearts hammering in perfect terror. Stone's gloved fingers brushed against a branch, adjusting their position imperceptibly. The patrol passed, unaware of the dozen men lying in wait, swallowed by the jungle. Blake signaled the fade, a slow, deliberate movement forward, and the group advanced another 50 meters, careful to avoid every broken twig, every disturbed leaf. Suddenly, a whistle shrieked from the enemy line, sharp, piercing, unnatural against the drumming rain. The NVA had tightened the noose, bringing forward reinforcements. Blake's jaw clenched. This was the moment where the ghosts had to become hunters. The Australians moved as one, weaving through the undergrowth, silent and precise. Miller and his men followed as shadows of shadows, learning survival in real time under the tutelage of soldiers who seemed almost supernatural. Then the first obstacle revealed itself. A swollen creek, its waters roiling with the fury of the monsoon. The current ripped at the banks, dragging debris and mud like a conveyor belt of destruction. Crossing it would be a gamble. Every step risked disaster. Every misplacement could cost a life. Blake's mind raced, calculating angles, velocities, and the minimal risk path. "Stone," he whispered. "Rope first, anchor tight, watch the line." Stone plunged into the water first, securing the lifeline across the churning gap. One by one the SAS crossed, bodies low, moving in sync with the river's rhythm, keeping balance, avoiding the violent pull of the current. Behind them, the Americans hesitated. The young private's leg trembled as he gripped the rope, but Lawson moved in like a living shield, placing himself between the boy and the river, absorbing the violent thrash of water and fear. One misstep, one scream, and they would all have been exposed. But the Australians had trained for this. They had lived in this environment. Survival was more than instinct. It was discipline, patience, and a mastery of fear itself. Finally, all 12 men reached the far bank, mud-caked, exhausted, but alive. The enemy patrols continued their futile sweep, unaware that the trap they had set had been inverted. The hunters had become the hunted. Blake raised a hand, signaling a brief halt. Silence, save for the rain and the whisper of the jungle, enveloped the men. He scanned the perimeter, noting the subtle signs of the enemy's presence. Broken branches, displaced leaves, faint scents carried on the wind. Then, without a word, he motioned forward. The jungle had more trials to offer, and the night was far from over. The dense jungle seemed almost sentient now, pressing in from all sides, carrying the cries of distant wildlife and the constant whisper of flowing water. Blake crouched low, eyes scanning the shifting shadows. Ahead, the faint outline of a ridge marked a potential ambush site, and he knew the Australians had already considered it. "Positions," he whispered. The SAS moved fluidly, splitting into small tactical elements, their movement invisible against the backdrop of dripping foliage. The Americans mirrored as best they could, struggling to match the precision and silence of men who had trained for this exact moment. The enemy had become bolder. Rustling from above, a faint crack, almost inaudible over the rain, signaled scouts moving along a higher trail. Blake counted 3, maybe 4 figures, rifles angled, scanning blindly. He waited. Then, with the patience of predators, the Australians struck. No shots were fired, only the subtle snapping of necks and the soft thud of bodies hitting earth. By the time the patrol realized they were under attack, it was already too late. The Americans stared, frozen, as Blake signaled them to move forward, eyes wide in a mix of terror and awe. The path narrowed. The creek was behind them, but now the challenge was vertical, climbing a steep, mud-slick ridge under a watchful eyes of enemy forces. Trooper Quinn took the lead, using vines as handholds, his movements almost graceful despite exhaustion. Behind him, the Americans struggled, boots sliding, fingers digging into earth, and roots for leverage. "Don't stop," Blake urged, voice low but urgent. "Move." Tore through leaves, cutting small arcs of fire tore through leaves, cutting small arcs of rainwater from the branches. The Australians had anticipated this. Using the foliage and terrain, they returned fire with silent pistols and throwing knives, neutralizing the shooters before the Americans even realized where the threat had come from. By the time they reached the ridgetop, the moon had pierced through the clouds, revealing the extent of the enemy force. Dozens of NVA troops moving through the jungle below. Blake counted them, heart pounding. The Australians surveyed the field with calm precision, formulating a plan with gestures and slight nods. The Americans could only watch and learn, following each command like students of a deadly craft. "Flank left," Blake instructed, pointing toward a dense thicket. The SAS team moved like shadows, disappearing and reappearing, striking enemy patrols with calculated precision. Each movement was a lesson in jungle warfare, a demonstration of patience, stealth, and timing. Miller's unit followed, hesitant but alive, adapting quickly under extreme pressure. Hours passed in the relentless rain, every moment an exercise in tension and vigilance. By dawn, the enemy had been driven back, leaving the ridge eerily silent. Mud and blood coated every uniform, exhaustion etched deep lines into faces. But the victory was theirs. Blake looked at his team, the Australians, composed, efficient, almost otherworldly, and then at the Americans, wide-eyed and covered in grime. He nodded once, acknowledging what they had survived and what they had learned. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you saw the jungle, you felt the fear, and you survived because you moved as one. Remember this, because it's only the beginning." The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the dense green canopy and the winding trails below. For the Americans, it was a dawn of new understanding. For the SAS, it was just another night survived, another lesson taught in silence and blood. The jungle was alive, but it had a darkness unlike any other, a darkness that seemed to watch, to listen, to judge. Sergeant Blake crouched low in the mud, his breaths measured, counting each one as though it were a lifeline. Behind him, the Americans moved with uncertain mimicry, their eyes wide and bodies tense, following the lead of men who had long since become ghosts in this unforgiving world. The monsoon rain had turned the forest floor into a slick, treacherous web of mud, leaves, and roots, each step a potential betrayal. Every sound, every flicker of movement could spell death. Yet the SAS moved with a terrifying serenity. Freeze, fade, disappear. These were not tactics. They were a philosophy. For hours the hunt continued. The North Vietnamese soldiers were methodical, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence beyond mere manpower. But Blake's training had taught him to read the jungle as if it were a book. Each broken twig, displaced leaf, and distorted web, telling the story of the enemy's mind. One misstep could cost lives. One hesitation could spell failure. Stone moved ahead, gliding silently, a shadow among shadows. He paused at a bend in the trail, signaling the halt with a finger pressed to the lip. Ahead, the river roared, a swollen torrent of mud and water that had been a gentle creek just the day before. Crossing would be deadly, but it was the only option. One by one, the Americans and Australians clung to the rope that Stone had secured, moving as though every motion was observed by the forest itself. And then disaster struck. One of the Americans, exhausted and injured, lost his footing. The river seized him with merciless strength, pulling him under. Panic flared. But Lawson, the towering medic, plunged into the torrent without hesitation. Not a word was spoken, not a sound. One. Not a word was spoken, not a sound aloud. Survival demanded discipline as lethal as the enemy itself. The group reached the far bank, soaked and trembling, yet alive. But safety was an illusion. Ahead, the forest pulsed with threats, and Blake knew the enemy had realized their elite tracker was gone. They were being hunted, not swept. The SAS doctrine demanded action. Blake detached himself from the group, becoming the predator in the hunt, circling back to intercept the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese tracker, stalking their trail. For an hour, the two masters of stealth danced in near-total darkness, a deadly chess game where the slightest misread of terrain or sound could end in instant death. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath as Blake used classic SAS deception, creating small noises, freezing and drawing his opponent out. In less than 5 seconds, the duel ended. The tracker was neutralized, a life extinguished in the suffocating embrace of the jungle, unseen by any eyes but those of Blake. Blake rejoined the patrol, not as a hero, but as a harbinger. The enemy, realizing their specialist was gone, shifted from a patient hunt to a frenzied swarm. The stealth phase was over. It was now a battle of bullets, not shadows. The Australians and Americans fanned out into a snap ambush, a brutal maneuver designed to break the enemy's advance in mere seconds. For 40 seconds, the forest was a maelstrom of rain, mud, and controlled fury. When the last shots echoed and silence fell, the enemy was gone, the threat broken. The monsoon had passed, leaving the jungle in a fragile, uneasy silence. The 12 men, Australians and Americans alike, finally exhaled, their bodies aching, their minds raw from hours of tense survival. The river had claimed its toll, but all had made it across, thanks to discipline, trust, and the invisible hand of the SAS that had guided them. Sergeant Blake stood for a moment on the far bank, eyes scanning the dense tree line. The threat was gone, but the memory of the hunt remained. Each snapped twig, each whisper of leaves, each shadow moving just out of sight had been a test of courage, patience, and understanding the jungle itself as both adversary and ally. For the Americans, it was more than a rescue. It was a lesson in human limits. The SAS were not just soldiers, they were students of fear, silence, and control. They had shown what could be achieved when the mind, body, and environment worked as one. Miller looked at his men, mud-caked, exhausted, yet alive, and understood that bravery was more than guns and bullets. It was restraint, observation, and the courage to act at the right moment. And for the Australians, the night reinforced a lesson ingrained over decades of jungle warfare. Invisibility, patience, and precision could save lives in ways firepower never could. They were the ghosts of the forest, and sometimes the ghosts were the only ones who could deliver salvation. As dawn broke over the Puuc Tuy province, mist curling over the bamboo, the men moved quietly toward extraction. The jungle seemed indifferent to their passage, yet for those who had survived, it had left an imprint deeper than any scar. A memory of fear mastered, a bond forged in silence, and a truth all would carry forever. Sometimes the deadliest hunters were the ones who never made a sound.